My name is Nick Westcott. I'm the director of the Royal African Society. Together with the IAI, are the sort of co-founders of the African Arguments book series, of which this is the latest and most recently distinguished example that we're going to hear about this evening, but which has a long and distinguished history. And there are many back numbers that you are also welcome to buy, but focus on this one first for today. And I can't think of a more interesting subject to resume our physical book launching events than Angola, for long a rather neglected subject in this country. But Paula's research has shone light into those shadows that you refer to, and dragged the dark recesses of the state into public view, whether they like it or not. And we therefore look forward very much to hearing your account of that. This is, of course, not all that the Royal African Society does. We have a plethora of events now that we're allowed to have real events again. Last year, we celebrated our 120th anniversary, but because of the constraints last year, we had some events, but not a party. So we're having the party this year, and that will be in November, to coincide with the 10th anniversary of the Film Africa Festival, which some of you may have heard of. Some of the best new films from all across Africa playing in cinemas all across London. And we'll be advertising that later on in the year. But we also hold a lot of events on current crises and topics. So we will be covering the Kenyan elections later this month in a panel, which keep your eyes on our website. We'll be covering the Nigerian elections as we get towards the end of the year. A lot more fun there. We are resuming our business breakfasts with starting, for those of you who are corporate members, with a detailed examination of the South African economy from the President's economic advisor. That should be particularly illuminating, we hope. And then, of course, in September, there's the African Studies Association conference, which will be half virtual because it's being co-hosted by Ibadan and Nairobi, and half physical at the University of Liverpool. And it will be a feast of intellectual stimulation on all aspects of African studies. So again, that's on the ASA UK website. So we look forward to you joining us if you can for any or all of those events. But I can now hand over to Tom Burgess. We're very pleased to have Tom to moderate today's event, author of the recent bestseller, Kleptopia, a man whose FT career as an investigative journalist has led him to know more about dirty money than most people, and knowledge he has put to good use, trying to clean it up. The anti-money laundering launderer, or whatever. Tom, I can't think of anyone better to moderate this discussion, so let me hand over straight away to you. Thanks all for coming, and thanks to the panel for being here, and especially Paula. Lovely to have you. Thanks.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks, everybody, for coming. I hope your glasses are all charged. Who we're going to be hearing from. We're very lucky to have Miles Tendi with us. I'm going to read your biodata. You're an associate professor in the politics of Africa at the University of Oxford's Department of Politics and International Relations and the African Studies Centre. Your interests are civil military relations and intelligence studies. You joined the African Studies Centre in 2017-18. And before that, you held the departmental lectureship in African politics in the Oxford Department of International Development. That's from 2011 to 2017. And before that, you were at Control Risks, which we might ask you more about over the wine later. Now, we're also going to be hearing from Patrick Smith. Now, as you'll be aware, the Royal African Society and Chatham House are very much the MPLA and the UNITA of London Africa. London African debate. And unforgivably, Smith presented himself at Chatham House this evening when he's meant to be here, but he's been turned around and he's on the back of a motorbike or something like that coming this way, and he will arrive, I'm assured. Now, Paolo, I'm going to read your official bio and then I'm going to explain how I know you. Paolo is an independent analyst, very much so. She's been an advisor on Sub-Saharan Africa for the Crisis Management Initiative, a senior analyst for Southern Africa with the International Crisis Group, a senior researcher with the Institute for Security Studies down in South Africa, and is a founding member of the South Sudan Center for Strategic and Policy Studies in Juba, from which she has a story or two, and has a PhD in International Development from the University of Oxford. Now, I met Paola when I was a very green foreign correspondent based in Johannesburg, rolling up in Angola and Luanda for the 2008 election, without the first idea what was going on. I was fortunate enough in, I believe, the bar of the Tropico Hotel. Yeah. Mutters. Yes, so many secrets exchanged in that place. Very fortunate to be introduced to Paola, and very quickly to say, would you mind explaining to me what in God's name is going on here? Who is who? It was incredibly, I've been in South America before and done some African reporting, but Angola is a brick wall for trying to understand how power works. It's also fabulously important. I think its importance is often neglected because it's so difficult. And in the media, certainly, people think, I think we'll just do Kenya again. But Angola, a strategic oil supplier, a crucial vector for the big power competition, great power competition in Africa, especially the rise of Chinese influence in Africa, and just on its own terms, an extraordinary story of massive wealth and massive human suffering. And you have done in this fantastic book, and I urge everyone to follow this example and buy at least a minimum of 5 copies, all of which Paolo will be happy to sign afterwards. You've done what people have been trying to do for a long time, which is unravel this and give us a real sense of what lies beneath. And I think makes me think back to that first conversation we had when you explained to me this idea of a shadow state, a state which has a face that looks like, that has all the bits and pieces of a normal country, central banks, health ministries and so on, but has a secret state within it. So this is quite enough from me. I'd just like to ask you to begin with, what have you discovered that we should know about?
Well, so thank you, Tom, and thank you for hosting this book launch. Thank you for everyone for being part of this launch. I'm very grateful and very humbled. I'm very humbled by Tom, who's extraordinary, and Miles and Patrick whenever he arrives from Chatham House. So in my 40-minute cab ride here, I tried to explain to the cab driver what my book was about, and I got a blank stare and silence. I hope I get a little bit more of I'll do a better job here. So the book tells a story about how power was structured over 40 years in Angola. It looks, like Tom said, at shadow power. So you had the parallel illusionary dynamics of, on one side, development and nascent democracy. On the other hand, you had a hegemonic power and securitization. Power, in essence, was centralized in the presidency, most specifically in 2 mega structures that controlled, shadowed, paralleled, instrumentalized, and directed the policy of government, infiltrated society, and in very much operated to on the Angola Rising perspective. So Angola coming out of one of Africa's most brutal and deadliest civil wars, rising from the ashes in double-digit growth rate from its oil boom that peaked in 2012. And very much looking at how the political control in Angola was wielded by economic opportunities, patronage, corruption, etc., and never looking at the undercurrent of what stabilized all of that. And that, in my perspective, was the security apparatus. Now, the security apparatus was one of the tools that the presidency used to deflect any threats. Now, Tom, in a call yesterday, said, well, you've got to explain what you mean by securitization. So securitization broadened, theoretically, the areas of intervention of security. So state security was very much a sphere of political and military issues. Securitization went into non-security issues of the economy, society, the environment. So mobilizing problems such as immigration, poverty, underdevelopment, unemployment, all of these could be construed as security threats to the state. Again, in the theory, when one government, so they initially deemed it as a speech act. So when the word security was mentioned, it would push policy and politics in the direction of extraordinary measures. So it would take policy outside everyday politics. So there was an existential threat defined, and the policy enacted to address that. And we saw that with COVID-19, which was the single most global moment of securitization in the world, where you had states of emergency were enacted, extraordinary powers were accrued to develop contingency plans, armed forces, the police were deployed to enforce public safety measures, etc. So this was a moment of global securitization. In some countries, securitization is not exceptional politics, it's everyday politics, and that's the case in Angola. So in Angola, you have securitization as a speech act, but also as an infrastructure, as a political order, and as a post-conflict political strategy, state-building strategy. And when I mean, what do I mean by this is underneath, in the shadows of this megastructure of the presidency, where power was truly concentrated, was also in the civil, so they had two megastructures, the civil cabinet and the security cabinet. And the security cabinet wielded extraordinary power. In fact, they, in 2012, out of a national budget of $69 billion, they had 12 billion for their own use, if you accounted for the Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of Interior. And within this array and this big universe were unelected officials, were military apparatchiks, were politicians, technocrats, generals, intelligence officers, foreign advisors, many were Cuban and Russian and Israeli, that were all there veered towards ensuring that the political project of the presidency wasn't threatened, even from within. And in some states, for example, like in Zimbabwe and South Africa, the security apparatus and securitization is used and instrumentalized to bring the ruling, so the factions within ruling parties under control. In Angola, the war mentality of zero sum never actually disappeared in peacetime. So the us versus them mentality continued. And so the way the last 20 years of peace have been built has been on perceptions of paranoia, fear, and threats that never existed. So, and this is very much a result of the way the war was played out over 30 years, where you had a confrontation of two states, two versions of nationalism, two versions of historical purpose, two versions of what it meant to be Angola. And none of those were ever reconciled, not in peacetime. And the ruling party that won militarily understood that even in peacetime, it would never be seen to legitimately represent whole segments of society that did not see themselves in their own political project. And so it was very much about control, about power, and about ensuring permanence and political longevity. So, and the irony is that in the first decade, and I'd even say until about 2017, there was no need to create and to live on a perception of threats because there was no appetite at the at the ground level, at the grassroots level, for protests, for any level of insurrection. People wanted peace. They didn't want political contestation. Yet now the irony is that the very system that was built to protect from fabricated threats created the very threats it never wanted to exist. So in the process of building an apparatus to protect very narrow political interests, it entrenched poverty, marginalization, and inequality. And today, as we head into elections in August, we see a country that is very much ready to take to the streets. We see an alignment for the first time in, I'd say, since '92, where we have an opposition that is mobilized and united enough to win these polls. A securitized state will react violently to that. And we've seen cases like that in Ethiopia and in Zimbabwe in 2008 when the MDC did win. So I'll stop there.
Well, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, and then we'll hear from Myers and Patrick. Good evening, Patrick.
Good evening. Look, very sorry.
I've already
Unbelievably bad planning.
I forgot.
Went to the wrong place at the wrong time.
I forgot to say that for those on Zoom, please do ask questions whenever you feel like it, and we'll take some as well as plenty of questions from in the room in a few moments. But I'd just like to know, for the aspiring authoritarian kleptocrat, how do you go about this? I think what's so marvelous about the book is that it demonstrates that beneath this veneer, beneath this kind of shadow government, ultimately there's fear. It's the rule of fear. For the aspiring kleptocrat, authoritarian, how do you practically go about that? How do you keep people sufficiently scared that you can, as you put it so well, ensure permanence? What's that like to live under? How do you actually visit that kind of fear in a population effectively?
So I would say that fear is, there are different audiences for this fear, right? So the fear also needs to start from within. So the MPLA is an amassed party, but it's weakened. Its collective leadership structures don't really operate to keep in check the power of the presidency, but they're useful and they're necessary. And so you have to create this wide array of alliances where you trade in opportunities and possibilities and power, and you will allow everyone to benefit from the spoils of peace. And if they step out of line, they know that they will be punished in one way or another, either with a corruption drive, either with political decommissioning. And so fear also works from within the elites, and so within the ruling party. Not so much only, well, not so much, but not only in the population. In the population, I think, we had this sense of and I think, Patrick, following Angola for so many years, the 1977 massacre, there were two big political moments.
Just for those who may not be versed in every twist of Angola, so just tell us what that was. So
the 27th of May, 1977 massacre was an internal MPLA purge. And that happened under the first president of Angola, Agostinho Neto. And we still don't know, but as many as 30,000 MPLA members were cleansed in a few weeks. They carried on cleansing in the capital and in the provinces in the following months. And it was deemed as in the popular poetry of history, as in, this is a case of what will happen if you step out of line from the political direction that we have chosen to take. You had that internally. You also had that in 1992 with the post-election violence, where again, the opposition was deemed to be a threat to the state, a threat to society, which wasn't difficult because in 1992, UNITA was very much a heavily militarized party, which it isn't today. But ironically, you've had elections where you have the opposition being deemed as a threat to the nation, to stability, and the MPLA being positioned as the guarantor of stability. So if the MPLA loses power, then chaos will unravel, and there will be instability, and there could be war.
Right, and that spectre hangs over Angolan life every day. It's so recent, the visceral horrors of that war. It's hard. I want to bring Miles in here. It's hard to ride that kind of tiger without getting eaten. And José Eduardo dos Santos, Angola's ruler for decades, seems to be managing a pretty more or less graceful dismount, maybe less graceful for some of his children. But in Zimbabwe, another one we might call securitized state, Mugabe seems to have been eaten. And I want to just tease on this comparison a little bit and say, Miles, maybe you could speak to this, but you know the Zimbabwean machine very well. If we were talking earlier about the Macbeth problem, right? Yeah. Once you start killing people to stay in power, it's pretty hard to change course or just retire gracefully to a golf course. What's the difference there, and what does Mugabe's experience tell us perhaps about what José Eduardo can expect?
Well, I'll make a comment and then maybe just get Paul to respond. I mean, I really wanted to shine here. What we're getting at here is essentially there are many parallels between Angolan politics history and the context of Zimbabwe, both countries that emerged from fierce armed struggles, deeply securitized states over time, and particular figures, long incumbents who dominated the political sphere for a long, long time. Mugabe in the Zimbabwean context, Dos Santos in the Angolan context, and as Paulo shows in the book, Dos Santos is kind of the big beast that presided over this structure. And to come into your question about Mugabe was pretty much the same, but as we all know in this room, in the end, Robert Mugabe ends very differently from Dos Santos. So that's one of the things that struck me reading the book. Dos Santos can actually step down, retire. Yes, they start going after his family and the sort, but the man himself, that's not how Mugabe ended. So I was really curious. One of the things I wanted to draw you out on here is what makes that possible for Dos Santos to walk in that way and not be eaten by the security structure in the way that Mugabe was, who fell via a coup. That's one thing. And then the other thing I'd like you maybe to talk about.
Well, let's have an answer on that.
All right.
Then we'll come back.
Okay.
Well, I think so. Dos Santos was towards the end was already presiding over decay. And so he did the graceful exit, which was, let me pass over to somebody else and allow them to navigate a very difficult reality. In 2014, there was an oil crisis that shocked the Angolan economy. So already Dos Santos understood that this was going to go in a very difficult direction. So he says, let me hand over now. But before he did, he enacted two policies that a few weeks into the new president's administration, he changed completely. One was to not allow the army chiefs, the intelligence chiefs, the police chiefs, so all the different units of the security apparatus to be changed. So what he wanted was he would retain the control of the securitized mass structure and the chairmanship of the party. And through that, he would have some sort of power that he could control from afar what was going to happen. He miscalculated, clearly. And so he didn't have the fate that Mugabe had, but he kind of did, in the sense that he lost everything. His children have been placed in a very difficult situation, facing criminal charges. One is arrested, other is being investigated, assets frozen. And the memory of this architect of peace, who is on his deathbed now, has been, well, in one aspect has been, enshrined in this myth of this is a man that did so much for the country, but in another aspect, this youth doesn't see that at all, and they see, well, actually, this the decay that he presided over and the injustices that he presided over very much bring us to the problems we have today. So history hasn't been kind to him like it wasn't kind to Mugabe. But it doesn't mean that history is going to be kind if UNITA wins either, because the current historical moment betrays UNITA in the sense that, you know, if we are emerging into a new Cold War, we're going to have interests over principles and stability and oil over democracy. And so we might have a very different outcome from that. Sorry. So I don't know if I answered that.
You were going to make another point.
Yes, very effective answer. The other thing I wanted to ask was this, I'm very big on gender. And so reading the book, I kept asking, where are the women? So I'd like you to talk a bit about the security state, what role women play intelligence structures, how its effects can be gendered, and of course to reflect a bit on your own positionality as a woman navigating this highly masculine security
Yes, if I just add a follow-up to that, you could also perhaps enlighten us as to what befell you while you were reporting this book, which I think illuminates quite clearly the perils for men and women of trying to operate in Angola.
So I spoke to one female colonel in the armed force. In the she was in the what do you call it? The Air Force. Sorry, that was it. There were no other women in positions of power, or even at the sergeant level, that were women. And it's strange because Angola had, at least, you know, on UNITA's side, entire battalions that were female led. You had warrior women, like mythological but real women like Rainha Ginga, etc., that were warrior women, but you don't have that reflected today in the security apparatus. It's very male dominated. So everyone that I spoke to were men. And it was, in a way, it was easy to speak to them because as a woman, I'm not seen as a threat. And, you know, almost like a paternalistic attitude towards, you know, she doesn't know, so let's explain. Which works in my favor in the sense that absolutely,
yeah, they got that wrong, isn't it?
No, because it's like, well, make me understand. And so it's as being unthreatening, it allowed people to speak. And it's very difficult because we can't forget that the people I was talking to wasn't really the opposition, were the people in power. And the people in power spent decades with the Soviet and Cuban mentality of it's unpatriotic to speak about things of national interest and state security to people that aren't part of the system. And so it took a long time. It took a long time to get to the understanding that actually they wouldn't be mentioned by name, sources would be protected, and that they could talk to me because all I wanted to understand was the system. But it wasn't always easy. And what I think Tom is alluding to, and I begin the book with an episode of how, you know, November 2015, coming from the oil-rich province of Cabinda, where I had gone there to speak to some priests and civil society and members of FLEC, the armed movement, not them directly, but some of their supporters, I was poisoned. And I didn't think it was poisoning at the time until a sergeant of military intelligence came to visit me when I was very sick in Luanda. And he said, you know, there are two kinds of poison, the herbal and the chemical kind. You got the herbal kind, so you'll be fine. And this is something that we did very much in the Soviet era, which was even on airplanes. If people were going into Luanda, they could be, something could be put on their food so that they would be so horribly sick, they wouldn't be able to work, have meetings, and they just leave. And so, and that is something that still operates today. And so it's a very intrusive and a nasty operation. And I've seen it with, but also other issues of, you know, I was, several messages reached me over the years telling me to correct course and not to ask questions about these things, threats directly.
We're all very pleased that you've ignored that friendly advice. With the questions, hands shooting up, I just want to go to Patrick. I didn't introduce you earlier, and I'm pretty sure everyone knows who Patrick is, but you know, one of the all-time great Africa journalists, editorial director of Africa Confidential, founding editor of the Africa Report. So everyone's first phone call whenever anything happens in Africa. Patrick, can I just ask you, someone I don't know, how long ago is it since your first trip to Angola?
I first went in '92, for the big election you talk about.
Right, and you must have glimpsed into this shadow state. Yeah, you must have seen into this machine. And maybe I could ask you something. Feel free to ignore this if there's other things you picked up on. But what's it all in service of? Paolo talks about the ensuring the permanence of the presidency. Yeah. When you see behind the veil, and you see what's really going on within the power machine in Angola, what's it all for? Is it to advance some grand vision for Angola and humanity, or is everyone just on the take?
No, I don't agree with the latter. Not everyone is on the take, and there's a whole range of motivations. I mean, first of all, I just want to say, congrats. This is a brilliant work. It's like, as you mentioned, there's Tony, there's Ricardo's book, and this is going to go down in the annals. It's a must read to really explain what's going on in Angola. Never more topical than, as you say, we're heading into an election next month, which is going to be probably the most decisive election in Angola since August. No, it was actually September 1992. So, so 30 years later, there's another absolutely sort of milestone election in Angola, and this is the book to read. So just, Tom, your question, I mean, I was actually trying to think of parallels, and I know it's always a bit specious, but, Khrushchev was a kind of technocrat who was very good at managing stuff, and then got lucky and ended up sort of running the Soviet state. But in the end, he wasn't up to didn't have the ruthlessness of his predecessor. Dos Santos was a technocrat who ended up running the Angolan state, and absolutely did have the ruthlessness of his predecessor. And partly, I think he developed that ruthlessness as a result of what Paula gets into with this whole securitization. He learned to use that system. He wasn't of that ilk. He didn't have a great liberation war record or anything like that. He wasn't an historic freedom fighter leader in that sense at all. But he instrumentalized the work of the freedom fighters around, and used the opposition, the fight with UNITA, as a kind of political instrument till 1992. I think what is also really interesting about his exit, he transitioned to a kind of the nearest thing to a Putin-esque type figure, a man from the military who knew the inside out of the security system and the military system, but also a man, a bit like Putin in 1999, 2000, actually did come in with us on a wind of change. And the idea was, I sort of got sucked into this enthusiasm right from the beginning. Joe Lorenzo is going to be different. He's a guy who is, he's seen what went wrong. He actually came, one of the reasons why I went to Chatham House, actually, I was thinking when I first met, which is why I'm about half an hour late, sorry to tell you this.
I thought I was going to reveal it.
Right. But actually, the point about that story is that I first met him in 2001 or 2000 when he was in London, and he was speaking at Chatham House, and we went for a coffee afterwards. A mutual friend introduced me to him, and the mutual friend said, "This is the next president of Angola." And of course, he wasn't at that time, because he had the temerity to announce that Dos Santos was interested in leaving. And that got him sort of exiled for 15 years. But then he did, in the end, come back. And I think, the interesting thing is about, why securitization won out in the form of Lorenzo versus someone like Vicente, is Lorenzo was an operator. He knew the security system, and he was kind of trusted by them. With Vicente was just too damn clever and too damn rich and too damn oligarchical, I think, to fit in the securitization mode. But I mean, having taken over, I think it's really interesting what you're saying about that whole transition period and the conclusions you draw from it. That Lorenzo came in, he inherited this network, and then found out that he'd inherited this massive socioeconomic crisis. And, the party was about to break open, and the economy was about to, head south very, very fast. So COVID brought two things. I mean, eventually it brought higher oil prices, plus, he's got a very good woman finance minister who seems to have managed things pretty well in terms of dealing with the oil price and everything else. But he's very much into protecting the system, I think, and the party in this era. I mean, that seemed to be his big priority. So I think it's not a project in the same way that I think it is actually closer to Putinesque. It's the Putinesque system. It's not just an alternative political order. I think it grew out of the war, and then it became a vehicle for ensuring the MPLA stayed in power and all the interests around the MPLA. And I'm so sure some people within the party believe, well, this is it. We're never going to give it back to UNITA. So it was a way of keeping UNITA out of power. We're never going to give it back to the sort of the outright capitalist roaders, pro-Westerners. And we're not really going to hand it over to Beijing or Moscow in total. You know, so there was a sort of element of nationalism there, was an element of regime security. So I think it was a lot of different motives that's kept them there.
It's fascinating stuff. We started a little late, so if with everyone's permission, we'll run over a bit until they throw us out. But I think it's time for some questions. Certainly there was one
Tom,
here.
Can I just say something very, very quickly, just sort of topical news type thing. You know, Dos Santos is very ill.
Yeah.
And you know, may not make it actually to the elections. But I think it's just interesting what people were saying about how everything comes together. The family is actually feuding over the money.
Yeah.
And that whole Lorenzo period, Lorenzo had to make a choice. Do I sort of go all out war on the Dos Santos clique and just risk sort of ripping everything apart and maybe the party failing? Or is the opposition weak enough for me to launch a full attack on the Dos Santos clique, grab the resources back to the state, massive resources? I mean, Isabel had what, 20% of the national oil company in Portugal? I mean, you're looking at massive resources benefiting his regime by clawing those resources back, or just basically saying, well, together we've got to reunite the MPLA, win this election, and then go on. It seems he's done the latter. They seem to have got some sort of pact with the Dos Santos clique to make sure they win this election, however uneasy the relationships are. But I think it's just something to watch as we get into the election.
Absolutely. I think this is going to, I hope through questions we'll get onto this big question as well of can the securitized state ever let go? But let's take this question, this chapter from page waiting. There's a microphone.
Right, please have just 30 seconds.
Yes, quick one.
30 seconds.
I will invite you both back in, of course, but yeah quickly.
30 seconds, because there's so much that's wonderful about this book, and I could go on for a long, long time to praise it, but I wanted to just say one thing that concerns that. That is from a piece by Poveda and Curtis. What they did was to look at countries all around the world. When academic articles are written about their intelligence services. In the two leading intelligence journals, International Intelligence and National Security, and the Journal of Intelligence and Counterintelligence. As you can see, most of the articles, it's North America, Europe. The least is Africa. It's basically blank, no articles. Angola, there was blank too. And this is where I want to, from intelligence studies point of view, really praise this book. A lot of work needs to be done to fill in the white, the color. And I really want to commend Paula for really a step forward towards filling that massive gaps. The little we know about how intelligence agencies, security structures actually work in Africa, with a focus on the African states themselves. Often when this work is done, when Africa is thought about in intelligence studies, it's via the view of external intelligence agencies. Think, for example, Susan Williams' recent book, White Malice, CIA, Neocolonization of Africa, published by the same publisher. It's about the CIA in Africa. Well, here, what Paul has written is it's security structures in Angola, in Africa. So I think that it's actually brilliant and important from that point of view. I can say so much more, but I just want to say that.
Thank you.
Well done, well done.
Yeah, it's another reason to buy more copies. Can we have that microphone?
Thanks. My question, I think, has sort of been partly answered in a tantalizing way by the panel. But my question is, when you were saying that the security apparatus was created to deal with a non-existent threat and actually created that threat, I thought you were going to say because the security apparatus became the threat, but you didn't. You talked about popular protest. But it set me thinking, and the final example with Zimbabwe, the challenge for all these governments, dominant parties especially, but not necessarily, is how you keep your security apparatus in the box and subordinate. Mm-hmm. And we've discussed this, Miles. It failed in Zimbabwe. I mean, one of my theories is if you've got a commissar system, you come from a Marxist system, it's inbuilt. And you think about Kamuzu in Malawi, in the end, his security apparatus split and turned on him. So it sort of happens to everyone. So I think there's a regional context here. And my question is, was there any point when the security apparatus would have mounted a coup? Is there any circumstance in which the security apparatus might mount a coup, especially in the context of the elections? And Patrick sort of, I was thinking from what he said is maybe they've already mounted their coup, and that's how J-Lo got into power. But the basic question is, have they been close to a coup? In what circumstances might there be a coup?
Are there more pressing questions immediately, or should we take that one? Let's take a couple more. Jot your notes down, and then we'll come back to our distinguished panel here. There's two up here.
Hi, yeah, thanks. The book seems really interesting. So my question is maybe somewhat outside of this, but I mean, I focus mostly on economic issues. So I mean, when it comes to debt, there was a development, is there still a sort of developmental projects, all these massive projects, the sort of Kabula Kabasha hydropower dam, the airport. I mean, now we don't have the same access to credit, both from China and from sort of commercial creditors as you had previously. So, I mean, what is the strategy behind this? Is there still this kind of developmental vision under João Lourenço, or was this merely just a way to kind of siphon off? I mean, of course, a lot of these generals are very rich individuals now. So is the strategy to continue this, or just to get the big projects, finished, and then, essentially for how long are they prepared to essentially continue in this service, the extreme, the debt load that was run up under Dos Santos, where they do claim, or they do state that a lot of these funds were actually embezzled. So.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll take one more.
So I was very intrigued by what you said, that for the first time since 1992, the opposition could conceivably win and a securitized state could react to this. I'm interested, how likely do you think it is that Unita will win, and how exactly, excuse me, too much free wine, how much do you think?
It's encouraged.
So excellent, I'm going to take your word on that. You don't get that at Chatham House. I've forgotten the question some time ago. What I was saying was, how likely do you think it is the opposition will win? And if it does, how exactly do you think the securitized state will react?
Paul, I'm going to ask you to answer all three, and then Jen, I'll see if there's bits of them either of you would like to pick up on that. So we've got essentially, I think there's the first and the third are linked in a way. Could you need to win, and will the security forces mount a coup? And then the big development agenda, could there be something genuine in that now, or does it continue to be an enormous opportunity for plundering? Up to you.
So Dos Santos did what Chavez had to do in Venezuela, which was, and they learned this, I think, from the Cuban, certainly in Venezuela, they learned it from the Cuban experience, which was at the end of the war, the FAR, the Angolan armed forces, were a powerhouse. I mean, they were the ones that won the war. They were the ones that negotiated the peace agreement. It wasn't the politicians. And so Dos Santos had to do two things, which is what happened with the armed forces in Venezuela, to the point that now they don't have a role in politics. One was give economic profits and opportunities to the generals so that they have a stake in upholding the system. They don't want to bring down the system because they benefit from it. And you see that in Venezuela too. The second strategy was have intelligence services, military intelligence, guard the guardians. So understand how infiltrate and spy on them to make sure that nothing could ever happen that would mobilize within the ranks to come even close to thinking of mounting a coup. And the interesting thing is that, so that happened under Dos Santos. João Lourenço comes in and worsens this approach because he puts as the chief of staff the head political commissar of all time, which was General Discipline. So, General Disciplina, who was, it's his nom de guerre, but I mean, you already know, this is not a good thing. And he was the head of patriotic education. Now, patriotic education was the department of political commissars that migrated and transitioned in the post-war setting where, the political commissars he brings that even more. And not only the Presidential Guard, it's the Praetorian Guard, is the best equipped and best trained unit of the security apparatus to make front like a parallel army to the armed forces. Add to that paramilitary units that are politically inclined and mobilized by the MPLA. So you have an array of units that would never let a coup happen. The irony is, and the sad thing is, that the armed forces for many, many years were the only national institution that brought together a sense of unity because it brought together UNITA and MPLA. It was multi-ethnic, it was multiracial, and it was one of those institutions that truly had a national character. It still kind of is, but it has been depleted. So a coup would be difficult unless, I don't know, not the generals. I mean, we always said the coup could happen from the captains, which didn't in Portugal in '74. So,
Paolo, what if you need to win?
So if you need to, UNITA won't win because these elections will be rigged. If they were free, fair, and transparent, I would bet everything UNITA would win. And that's because people just want change. And we've seen that from polls. And the irony is that you have UNITA winning the not the rural vote, the vote of the cities, the vote of the youth, the vote of people that have higher levels of education. And so even Afrobarometer had a poll where UNITA and the MPLA were on par, but there was a huge section of those that were interviewed for Afrobarometer that didn't know how they were going to vote. So it could have gone either way. Anglo-Barometer, which is a polling outfit in Angola, actually posits UNITA's victory at 60% or 50-something%, depending on which of the months that they stage this polling. So the reality is UNITA's positioned to win. And if they don't win, the expectation has been created that, there could be street protests. And if there are street protests, because there's anger, then a securitized state would deploy first the Presidential Guard and the rapid police. They're the first units, they're the most vicious, they're the scariest. And then you would have probably a wave of deployments, including the armed forces. But then you might see a splintering, where the just like we saw with the Arab Spring, where the police are doing one thing and the armed forces actually say, well, no, we are the guardians of the nation here, and we will not allow, because for example, in Luanda, you have family members of these elements of the police and the security apparatus that would be on those streets. Would they fire against them? So anyway, on the developmental prospects on debt, so servicing of the debt is something that Angola has had to do and will keep doing. I mean, it's a slave to its debt. I mean, over more than half of the budget goes to paying its debt. And the developmental prospects are very constrained by this. And unfortunately, the windfall of oil prices that have been a result of this war in Ukraine are going to give the MPLA tools to invest in winning these elections. They won't invest that money into improving education and healthcare, which is what they should be doing, really. So this will be, it's very much factored as a short-term strategy to maintain power, not as a long-term plan.
I think what we'll do, Raga, is we'll take the 3 Zoom questions, go back to Paula, and then Jens, if you can pick up on any piece you'd like to from what you've been hearing. So Raga's going to read the questions. She's been culling any anti-party thought and will give us acceptable questions.
Okay, so we've got 4 questions. I think we can cover all of them. The first one is from Audrey Brown, and I think Patrick has kind of touched on that to a degree. So she's asking, what do we know about Dos Santos' health, and what effects might his death have on the MPLA and the politics of the country, especially in light of the elections? Alfonso Bumba has 2 questions. First, he asks, if you had to establish the scale of the problem, what would be the Cabinda share in it? And then his second question is, with the political military conflict in Cabinda still going, is it still going on? And with the people of Cabinda not allowed to speak out, discuss their political destiny, what then are the prospects for Angola to build a democratic society and become a state with rule of law? The third question is from Piers Pigo. What interest does Angola, what interest does the Angolan state, security and intelligence have in the foreign policy and security on the continent? So basically, what are their vested interests in the larger foreign policy security in the continent? That's it.
Paula.
Zé Eduardo's health, I mean, we don't exactly know details, but there are rumors that he is brain dead, and it's a matter of time until his body shuts down. So the elder statesman will die, probably, like Patrick said, before these elections. Now, the effects are going to be interesting, because on one hand, you may have this big wave of sentimentality regarding Dos Santos and the MPLA, and whitewashing the brutality and his mistakes, which he made many. Or you may have anger within the MPLA, fracturing because of the divisions within the MPLA, and also the fact that Chizé, his youngest, one of his daughters that comes after his oldest daughter, Isabel, said that his father, in one of the last times she spoke to him, was, and she said this on Instagram or Twitter or something, that he said he was so disappointed with João Lourenço that he wanted UNITA to win. And he wanted Adalberto to be president. So whatever that means, it's interesting that this is the way that things have maneuvered. So we could actually see this passing as a win again for UNITA against the MPLA. Afonso Bumba, what's the Cabindan share? I mean, Cabinda was the only province in Angola that was uniquely managed by the Security Bureau of the Presidency. None of the 18 provinces in Angola were managed uniquely. So the strategic portfolio that and
we should say the ground zero of the oil industry.
Exactly. Yeah. And for the longest time, there was this denialist position, which was there was never a military conflict in Cabinda. I mean, there was peace from Cabinda to Cunene, which is not the case. Now they've come out saying there is a war. And the terrible thing is that this war can be managed. Not the way it can be managed. There is a solution to this. There's autonomy. I mean, the Cabindan rebels have already said we will accept autonomy, not outright independence. So it's a tragedy, really, that it continues, and it's a tragedy that continues because it's also creating a lot of frictions within the armed forces. Units do not want to get deployed to Cabinda because they're going to die. And so it's one of the frictions within the Angolan armed forces. For Piers, what is the role of the security intelligence have on foreign policy? So Angola has 3 intelligence services: internal, external, and military. The external intelligence services operates at times as a foreign ministry. So you've had, for example, in the Central African Republic, you had the head of the intelligence service try to negotiate peace between the several rebel factions. And you think, why would it be a military man, an intelligence man, and not a diplomat? And so they've staged operations in the Congos, which for Angola, the political design of the region is a direct tie to Angola's own internal security. So there will always be interference in the Congos in every way possible. And the intelligence services, but more specifically the external intelligence services, is the outfit that will do that.
Jens, are there particular parts of that? You're the experts. Pick up on bits of that you think we should know more about.
The only thing I would want to is the bit about having the presidential guards and the sort. There's a book by someone called Erica De Bruyne called Counterbalancing and how to prevent military coups. And what Dos Santos did is precisely is counterbalancing. Now, what she shows in that book, came out 2 years ago, is that counterbalancing actually is very effective at preventing coups. So that explains why Dos Santos lasted a long time. But it's very risky as well. Risky in the sense that if you don't do the sequencing well, when you start to counterbalance, create these presidential guards, if you don't do it well, you may upset the conventional army, and they'll mount a coup against you. That's what happened to Kwame Nkrumah. He didn't sequence well. Clearly, these counterbalancing units basically fight to the death. So if the thing you're talking about ever does arise, it's going to be very violent and bloody. They will not give in that easily because basically their fate is tied to the incumbent. That's the only thing I would comment on.
Patrick.
Yeah, I just on the coup election thing, I'd say the fact that this is a really contested election and chunks of the MPLA, dissident chunks who want UNITA to win or want, I think it's probably worth saying to Alberto's wing of UNITA, because the old UNITA, the Savimbi-esque wing, is actually quite opposed to what Alberto stands for in terms of the renewal. That raises its own interesting questions about what would happen if there was an UNITA government, to what extent they would actually just take over this securitization and run with it. And maybe he says he wants to change it all. So, I mean, that's worth listening to. But also just on the mechanisms, Miles was saying, no one writes about Angola's security, except, of course, the security companies. I mean, it is the richest intelligence organization per capita, I think, in the world. I mean, they spend several billion a year on security, surveillance, counterintelligence, general spookery, year after year after year, long after UNITA was categorically defeated. And what is really interesting is their, should we say, promiscuous flirting between Israel, Beijing, Washington, Moscow. I mean, anyone who wants to sell you bugging equipment in the world has shown up in Luanda, stayed a long time and not been poisoned, but ended up often with fat checks as a result. It is one of the best resourced intelligence outfits in the world. But as we've seen, I mean, it does miss stuff. And the fact that we've got an election coming up, that they can't control the outcome. In fact, that we're even having a discussion about coups shows really the limits of securitization in some way as a political strategy and as a social reality.
We're going to finish at past, and if that's all right with everyone, do we've got any more questions in the room? We've got one down here, one up there.
Thank you so much, Paula, for that masterpiece. This question is actually coming from a youth from Angola who's just about to go to Angola to cover the elections and leave the Democratic Party. basically, I have got 3 questions. The first one is connected to this idea of some of the threats that they pretty much wanted to prevent, they created. I wanted to understand or get your thoughts on whether you see the opening of the digital space as one of those threats that they have literally created, because in 2017, when Lorenzo created a Facebook page, it literally opened up this digital conversation whereby he managed to sort of like close some of the biggest voice on the digital space, like Luati, like Rafael Marquez, and he opened up a space where all of us cannot speak politics. But what we saw is the mimification of the executive power now. And we see how the Minister of Interior is opening a TikTok account, how they're actually taking people make memes into national television, telling them you shouldn't make fun of the president. So how do you see that? And the second question is connected to the element of female representation. Obviously, we are dealing with a different context in terms of the presidency. We have a first lady that perhaps has got a higher history within the government than the president. And we know that some of the decisions that are being made is actually coming from her. How do you see her role when it comes to this new agenda or this new direction that the security system is going? And the last one is the money side of it, which we were just hearing some of it. And I ask this question because as we speak right now, we're actually dealing with one of the biggest case in terms of the security in Angola, where we're talking about the Lusati case, where we have hundreds and hundreds of generals that are actually been taken to court. And we have literally been surprised how this operated as a bank within a bank. We saw how the security, they don't talk, they don't make bank transfer. It's all about cash. And you have apartments, it's like an informal market that literally has been sustaining this whole system. Can you just talk a little bit more on the money side of it so that we can get your insight into that?
Brilliant, thank you. At the back next, please. Raga, is there anything essential we should take from Zoom?
Very quick question to Miles. And
We'll just take this quick Zoom question at the front and then come.
Sorry, Miles, this is for you. Someone in the audience, like online audience, is asking about the counterbalancing reference. Can you spell that for them?
No, Erica De Bruyne, Debruin. She teaches, I think it's Cornell.
Sorry, D-E-B?
D-E, then B-R-U-I-N. She teaches at Cornell Uni.
Okay.
Please.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.
And yeah, I'd like to echo what Miles have said, Miles and Thomas said about the book. Congratulations, Paula, really fantastic work. So my question is about actually to lean in a bit into something that Tom said earlier about the riding the tiger and getting off gracefully. I'm trying to sort of see whether, I don't know, I like to try to understand why Dos Santos, unlike Mugabe, didn't think of a succession plan that involved family. Given that, there is, from what you just said about his daughter, there seems to be a dissatisfaction in the way that his successor is, handled presidency since coming in. Presumably, there would have been some sort of foresight to know whether this person is someone you could trust. And I wonder why he hadn't sort of planned to sort of, have someone within his family replace him, as done in other countries. Thank you.
Okay, we've got one more here. Briskly, Nick, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah.
Sure, we can take one here, and then Nick can ask a question if he wants to. Just put your hands up, please, and then we're going to take part of swift answers to each of them, and then I'm going to come to each of you for your final thoughts.
I'll make this quick. So, Paolo, you said that the election would be rigged. I was just curious, how exactly do you think it will be rigged? Do you think it will be enough to ensure the MPLA do win? And if it does win, do you anticipate protests after the victory? Thank you.
Thank you. The question I have is the elements, foreign elements coming into Angola. Are we saying it's only the security state? I mean, security elements who are controlling everything? You said lots of those elements are benefiting a lot from the current system on the ground in Angola. What's happening? Who is benefiting the most? So for the status quo to continue.
You talk about foreign elements benefiting or within the regime, or both?
So we know about the elements within the regime, of course.
Yeah.
But there will be some
who's outside. Yeah, there's a few names I can think of, but okay.
The last question is also on the aftermath of the election. because the two possible scenarios, assuming it's stolen, one is the sort of DRC option where the people sigh and just go back to doing what they were doing, surviving and carry on and say, well, these guys are going to stay in power. The other is the Sudan option where they do take to the streets. But even there, eventually they were taken into government briefly and then thrown out again. In both cases, external factors really matter. The DRC, South Africa, was not going to back the real winners. And in Sudan, the UAE, Egyptians came in and said, it's okay, army, just take over, keep it stable. Is there an external actor who might play a role like that in Angola?
Right, so what we'll do, Paola, if you could talk about the digital space, about the Lusati case, about the First Lady, and a little bit about whether Jose Eduardo has kind of mishandled his succession. And then I'm going to ask all of you, Patrick and Miles, then any of you, Paola, just to touch on all these points about the election and how it's going to play out.
So absolutely, I mean, so to his credit, João Lourenço came in and opened the debate, the space for civil society, for the media, digital space. I mean, the last figure I had several years ago was that Angola only had 2 million users of social media. I think that has grown. So definitely the platforms are there and they're being used against him. So very much so, and it's mobilizing. It's fascinating to see. On the money side, the Lusati case and hundreds of generals taken to court. I mean, I think this is the expression é para inglês ver, in the sense that, the meaning that it's farcical. Because everyone knew that this happened. I mean, all of these units were siphoning money for ghost operations, for everything was paid in cash. In fact, you had whole units that wanted to be paid through bank transfers so that they could get loans for buying houses, etc. And there were protests about this. And so, the millions of dollars that pass through these different units in cash was waiting. I mean, it's waiting for corruption to happen. So this is plan. He did. I think he had thought of Manuel Vicente like a Medvedev figure, and then he realized actually he couldn't rally the elements that he needed, which was party support and support from the military. So he went for João Lourenço. He thought he had left everything aligned, and he made a mistake. His biggest mistake was to have involved his children in the looting of the country, which he had for many years not done. And then after 2011 or more, or a little bit later, when he placed Isabel dos Santos as head of Sonangol and his son as head of the Sovereign Wealth Fund, you think, gosh, he exposed his family in ways that he'd never done. So he got confident, and I think that was his miscalculation. So
foreign elements whose benefits Patrick and I have written about Sam Parr and these characters, but who do you?
Yes. Well, I think the complicity of Western governments should also not be, they can't be excused. I mean, we've seen it even during the war, from the American side, the MPLA always said, the Americans don't have permanent friends, they have permanent interests. And that was exactly it, when they needed to benefit whichever side, not ideologically at all, but for oil, they did.
Didn't Chevron used to pump oil from Cabinda using Cuban guards?
Yes, exactly. So that's exactly it.
Yeah.
So foreign interests have always played a role to the tune of whichever side they needed to benefit their interests, not the interests of Angola. So
Well, I'm going to jump in, if that's okay, and say, because everyone feels the call of the free wine. Patrick, then Miles, then Paola, the election, what's the scenario? What do you see? How does it play out? And to which I would add, is it possible for securitized state like this to relinquish power peacefully? Does it happen? Could it happen? Patrick?
I think if we get close to that, it's going to get extremely messy. And I think then you get into the foreign interest question, which looms very large in the middle of the current fuel crisis. Angola, a country with copious gas and oil resources, sort of almost up there with Nigeria and Algeria. It's, you know, America's great ally, just like Saudi Arabia at the moment, and Europe's great ally, of course. And I think they're going to do absolutely anything to keep the regime, a regime they can work with on board. And so that means whatever D'Alberto does, he must be talking, or must be on the line to Brussels, Washington. I doubt if he bothers to phone this place anymore, but Paris and Lisbon and Beijing, certainly. Look, I hope you guys are serious about your professed interest in democracy, because I'm about to win this election and I don't want you pretending that I didn't when I do. So, you know, I'm sure those negotiations have started already and they're going to be really interesting in over the next month. But I suspect they will come down in favor of whatever delivers sort of reliable output of oil and gas. But the people may think otherwise, and that's why it's going to be interesting to watch.
No, I would just two things. I mean, we know from the literature, it's very difficult to defeat incumbent parties in Africa. It's happened in a handful of countries. And certainly within Southern Africa itself, very rare that's happened. So, you know, there's a menu of manipulation. NPLA controls that menu. So I fully expect that they will manage the result. And even if they didn't, and I've heard questions a lot about the prospect of protests and the sort. We know from work by scholars such as Terence Lee, the protests will only succeed if significant segments of these securitized states defect inside of the protesters. See any semblance reading your book that there's that distinct possibility. You're nodding your head right now. I don't think that those kind of fissures actually exist. And this is why, for instance, when you think of the Sudan scenario, why they protest, they come out, but they're not getting anywhere because significant sections of that Sudanese have not. And I don't see that pattern emerging. So I think the status quo will hold. That's my 2 cents.
Paula.
So, sorry, there was a question of how elections will be rigged. It's in the book. I think we might even have a different scenario, which was the Zimbabwe scenario in 2008. If there's widespread post-election violence, we may actually see a government of unity coming in, and which won't change anything. So everything will stay the same. It'll be to stabilize.
Yes, Zimbabwe 2008.
Exactly. Yeah. And so, and in Kenya also. So it will be exactly the same. I think if UNITA does win, it'll be by miracle that they're allowed to win. And I've actually even said this, and I'm going to end on this note, which is, if I was the MPLA, I'd let UNITA win. You know why? Because the road ahead is so difficult that let the opposition fail and then come back and actually say, you need us to come back because we are going to save this country, because the road that they have ahead of them is to try and take a country that is in the entrails of a huge permanent economic recession and poverty in the levels and even hunger at the levels we didn't see during the war. So the road ahead is really difficult for the MPLA. So let UNITA win and see how they can manage.
The Angola 30 years ago was the place to understand the Cold War. It's about to become the place to understand the Cold War too. This is the book you need to do that. It's also the book your mother needs for Christmas. And so on. Paolo will be outside signing copies, but please show our appreciation for Patrick Amars and of course Paolo.
Very well, thanks. How you doing?
I'm all right.
All right.
Yeah. What happened with Chatham House? You went to the wrong joint.
I had something at Chatham later in the night.
Brilliant. Thank you, everybody.
How's everything going?
It's been all right.
Completely gripping.
Just supporting local friends.
Thank you.
Yeah. Where are you based in?
Yeah,
Yeah.
This is hard work to do.
Yeah.
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 I'm impressed.
Yeah, no,
Yeah,
I am.
well,
amazing.
It's great to read a book
yeah,
where
that was great.
almost everything is new, or you learn something.
I think we,
Hey, greetings.
yeah, we did well, right?
Yes, finally, yes. Apologies, yeah. This organization, I had some like 3 different things lined up, some Nigerian minister, then Chatham House thing, I got somehow managed to get them all middle up.
Demand and demand.
Yeah, I definitely will, yeah.
People, that's COVID, and people are nervous about COVID.
Yeah,
I think a lot of people
Interested in writing and
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
there's all sorts of events being.
making sense of what's going on.
Oh my goodness, the rising numbers.
That's
So,
I'm putting
closer to the election.
Closer to the
Yeah, I
election,
think that's the
okay.
more, because right now.
right, let's carry on this conversation.
Right,
Yeah.
okay, well, after, so